Okay, in this video I'm going to show how the config files in RetroPie link to each other, how it's set up, the directory structure, that sort of thing, what goes on behind the Emulation Station front end. And that'll help generally, although this video isn't solving a particular problem, it will help you understand what's going on. So if you do get a problem, you should be able to see what file is being read or how to open it and edit it manually. And also, there are a lot of older videos out there for previous versions of RetroPie. This one's for version 3 beta 2 that came out early April 2015, but there are a lot of videos for versions previous to that. And whilst for the majority of the part all of the versions do the same sort of thing, they emulate the retro games, the paths and directories quite often change. But if you understand the directory structure, you could see in an old video how to do something. Whilst the directory paths might say in one place, you can just apply that to the new location. So those videos are still, quite a lot of use. It's just the directory and the paths that are changing. So like I say, this is RetroPie version 3 beta 2, and I haven't really changed anything on this at all. It's pretty much as it came. All I've done is expand the disk space. You can see up here I've only used 7% of my card. And because this is looking more at the back end of RetroPie, where all the files and configuration files are, there's going to be a little bit of Linux commands. So I'll do a quick crash course in basic Linux commands. There's hardly any that you need to know, but they're really useful just to navigate through this interface, because there isn't by default a graphical interface to use it, and it's really not very difficult to use the text space access anyway. I'm connecting to it using PuTTY, but you could connect using a different tool. It's connected via SSH to give me this command prompt view, the terminal session. So some of the commands that are useful are, once you've logged in with username Pi, password Raspberry, you can double check where you are in the directory structure of the card, of the SD card you got in there, with pwd. That stands for print working directory. If I hit enter there, I can see my directory is home and Pi. And it's the same sort of process that you'll get in Windows with folders. It's a home folder with a Pi folder in it. So that's by default where it's put. Now if I want to change out of that directory and move somewhere else, I can use the cd change directory command. And if I put a space and two dots means go back a directory basically. So if I do that and then say pwd, it confirms that I'm now in the home directory, and then I can go back to the directory I was in. Or if you're somewhere else, navigated somewhere else, and you want a quick jump to get back to the home directory, you can just put cd and then that tilde sign, which is on a UK keyboard anyway, on the hash key next to the enter button. So if I press that, it goes back to the home directory as well, just a sort of quick route back. Now quite often you're going to need to know what's in a directory, so you can list it with ls and you can see what's in there. You won't have this find.txt, that's something that I created earlier, but if you want to remove a file that you temporarily put in there for whatever reason, you can remove it with rm. So if I put rm and type find.txt, or instead of typing the word you're looking for, you can start typing it like that, fi, and you can complete it by pressing tab, and it just auto-completes. If there were multiple files that began fi, it would beep and you could press it a couple of times and it would show you the options, so it's fairly intelligent with the tab. Press enter and it's removed. So if I list it now, it's not there. And also the way that the RetroPie system boots, there's a configuration file that it uses to set up this terminal session, I guess really. It colour in differently the files that you'll see. So blue is a directory. So if you see a blue name, that is a directory that you can go into. So we could go into the RetroPie directory, cd RetroPie, and press enter and get another list. Okay, so we've got 3 directories in there. Other commands that you'll see quite often, one is sudo. That means supervisor do, so perform an action as a supervisor. So if you don't have the standard permissions as user pi, you put sudo, type the command, and then you've got extra rights. Sometimes you'll run a script or a program that's in the directory you're in, but it won't see what's in that directory. That's not very clear. I'll show you an example. If I go back a directory and in RetroPie setup directory, Now in here you can see there's a script here, retropie underscore setup.sh. Excuse me. So whilst I'm there, actually, I highlighted that. You can double click on something to highlight it like that. Then at the cursor, if I want to type that out, I can just click the right mouse button and it'll spit out whatever you've double clicked on. So if I did that one, script modules, there, it's just a quick copy and paste method. But if we wanted to run retropie setup.sh, it should say, and we do this as supervisors, so if I do sudo retropie underscore setup, it says command not found. It's not found because this isn't in the path of the system. So unlike Windows, if you try to run something that's in the directory you're in, it will know it's there, but by default that isn't the case. So quite often some of the commands you run like this, you need to tell it, I'm trying to run something that's in the directory I'm currently in, and you can do that just by pressing // so quite often you'll see that before a command, and that's just saying I want to run this file that's in that directory. Okay. Sometimes, particularly if you've just written a new RetroPie image, if you've downloaded it from Pet Rock Block and put it to an SD card, by default it's not resized, so you might not be using all of the disk space, and you can quickly check that with the df space h command, and that just confirms the size of your card, the size of your card here, and how much you've used. So I have resized it because I've got only using 7%, so that's fine. But quite often people write a lot of ROMs to the ROM area, and it stopped working because it's run out of space really quickly. So it's just a quick way to double check you've got some space on your card. And that's basically all you're going to need for navigating through. There's one command we saw earlier is ls, and if I type that, you get a list of files in here. But if you want some more information, you can type ls space hyphen and then put some options for the list command. Like L, I think that's long output, then A, show me hidden files as well, and H, and show me size in a human readable format, so it's a lot friendlier output. If I go back to the home directory like that, and then put ls, lah, there you can see that there's a lot more files in here because there's a lot that are hidden. So if I just do ls here, you can see I've only got 2 files in that show normally, which is RetroPie folder and RetroPie setup folder, which are here, RetroPie, RetroPie setup. The rest are all hidden, and the definition of a hidden is effectively just a full stop before it. So everything with a full stop doesn't show normally, and it's just a tidier way of putting some files that you don't really need to see all the time. The light blue colour, if you see that when you're navigating about, it's basically like a redirect. So although there is a folder here called full stop advanced, or it's advanced but just hidden with the full stop at the start, that will redirect to this path. So if an emulator or another program insists on looking in a hard-coded directory, for example, somebody who builds the RetroPie setup, or you can edit it as well, you could say that I want to create a redirect. Whilst I know the application will look here, I actually want to keep the files here, and it will just cause it to move. So sometimes when you're navigating through, you might see the same file in 2 places, but it's not, it's just a redirect. Similarly here, it looks like the Atari 800 emulator, whatever that's called, I forget at the minute, looks in the home directory for Atari 800.cfg, but it's not actually stored there, it's stored in opt retropie configs Atari 800 Atari 800 CFG. So that's just what the light blue means. Oh, actually, that's red, isn't it? That's not light blue, so ignore that. But it must be some other sort of redirect. Not too sure about that one. Again, blue is a directory, so you've got Emulation Station directory there. That's not the directory where it's actually stored, Emulation Station. It's just one of its sort of application paths. I'll come on to that in a minute. GNGO, again, just a redirect to this file here. And Atari, similar one there. Okay, and I didn't notice. Oh no, I've installed Steven Self Scraper. That's why that's there. That won't be there by default, and that's probably where the hash is. Just have a look in that folder a second. cd .s self scraper list there. Yeah, hash CSV. Okay, that's largely irrelevant, but it was quite interesting for me. Okay, right. So when you log in, you will end up in this directory, which is the home directory, and we're going to navigate to a few of the folders just to show you where everything is. So a lot of the detail is in the RetroPie folder. Go there first, cd RetroPie, and there we've got BIOS for your BIOS files, like the GBA's got a specific one, and some of the other consoles need a BIOS file to run. By default there's some placed in there. Okay, MSX BIOS files, and some of the files just to put that aren't required by every system. The large majority don't need these, like Super Nintendo, Mega Drive, that sort of thing, but it's just place for the BIOS. And the main one here, you can see ROMs, and these are the directories that you put all the ROMs. We've got Genesis here, and that's just going to link to Mega Drive, so that's not an actual folder, it's a redirect up here. So you go into these folders and you put your ROMs, and then Emulation Station will show you the games that you can play there. If you don't put ROMs in here, like for example there's probably nothing in Master System, then Emulation Station won't even have a menu entry for Master System. You have to put ROMs into the folders for it to then appear. So if any of these are empty, it won't show. If I go into SNES, I've put some in there. So cd SNES list, and I've just got a list of the SMC files that are the ROMs for Super Nintendo, and we'll see a file in a minute that shows you which extensions are needed for a particular ROM set. But that's where the ROMs are kept anyway, in this directory, well, not this SNES one, but the HomePie, RetroPie ROMs. That's where they will be stored. Or you could put them, you can have them on a sort of attached device instead of the SD card, but I think having it on the SD card makes everything a lot easier. Okay, so anything else to see in that ROMs directory? Okay, that's all in the ROMs folder, and if you've got a lot of text on the screen, you can clear it up with the word clear, hit enter, and it just cleans it up a bit. Now in that RetroPie directory, we've got a RetroPie menu directory, and in there it's some files that basically populate that screen in Emulation Station that says RetroPie to run some commands that you can otherwise run in here if you don't want to use the terminal session. But these are all be empty files. The definition of them is in the Emulation Station file, which we'll see in a second. So you don't really need to do anything with those. Got a RetroPie directory, and if we go up a directory here, there's a RetroPie setup directory, and that's where you run the setup script. There are a lot of other configuration files in here, but you don't really need them at all, so there's not much point us going into these supplementary folders, tools, etc. You don't need that, but you do want to run this RetroPie setup, and you can do that with sudo. And as we saw before, because I'm in this directory and I want to run it, // right mouse there, hit enter, and there we go, we're in the setup. Now, if you write the RetroPie image that's on the RetroPie website, you don't need to do a binary-based installation because it's already installed. You've written the image. You don't need to do a source-based installation, so don't do these top two. Experimental packages are ones that haven't been fully tested with the RetroPie setup, so you wouldn't know necessarily if they're going to be as reliable as you'd want, but you can look in there and see what's available. So you've got Dreamcast emulator that isn't installed by default, a 3DO emulator, Minecraft, Kodi, so you can install these, just hit enter and it'll run through an install process. But the main one that I'd want to do in here is the setup configuration, which is to be done after the install, because we're going to look at configuration files, and a key one is a controller configuration file, particularly for the RetroArch controllers or libretro. So if we go in there, whilst there are a lot of options here, and most of them are self-explanatory, the only one we're interested in at the moment really is configure input devices for RetroArch. So I'm going to do that. I've plugged it into my Pi. I've got a keyboard and a joypad. It's a iBuffalo joypad that looks like a SNES controller. So if I hit enter there, it says, do I want to configure the keyboard or the joystick for RetroArch? I want to do the joystick or the controller. And it says connect only the controller to be registered. Okay, so just make sure I haven't plugged in a separate one or two of them or something else. Hit OK. And first thing it says, just make sure that on the joypad the buttons aren't depressed or one of the direction buttons sort of already in that direction. Just make sure it's all neutral. So it usually would be, and hit enter, and you get about 4 seconds per button press. So you want to get ready to press buttons on the joypad to send this through. Right, B, Y. So let's start up, down, left, right, A, X, left button shoulder, right button shoulder. Okay, I don't have an L2 button or the other one, so I just let it run through and time out on these ones that I don't have. It won't be a problem. This will, at the end, you'll see this generate a file. Now, I don't know if it's still the case, but I know in previous versions it could cause a problem if you try to do this at the same time as, let's say, Emulation Station is running. So it's worth quitting that before you try and connect to a terminal session like this. I'll show you how to double check that Emulation Station isn't running in a second, because it can cause a lock on the controller. Like I said, I don't know if it does with this version, but I know it did previously. It was a bit of a problem, so just make sure that's quit out. That's just running through. In case you do have a controller with more buttons, you can configure them up. It's got quite a lot of options there. Okay, so what it says now is that it has been saved, and it gives you here the file name that it's been saved as, which is quite useful if you want to double check some settings that we'll look at in a minute. So it's USB, 2-axis 8 buttongamepad.cfg. Okay, so that was all successful, and it gives you the file name that it's finished with there. Hit OK, and I'm going to hit cancel there, and cancel there, and we're back out. Now, quickly, I'll show you how to show if Emulation Station's running. So processes of user pi, hit enter, and this is what the user pi is running at the moment, these programs, and Emulation Station isn't showing there, so it's not running, so that's all good. If it was running, you just go to your display, your TV or whatever, quit out of it. And do note that with this version, when you quit out of Emulation Station and it goes to the sort of black screen with the text, you get 5 seconds to press a key to confirm you don't want it to automatically restart. And it's set to automatically restart in case maybe you just added a few ROMs and you want to quickly get Emulation Station to recognise that. So it's quick if you just escape out of Emulation Station, it auto boots up and it sees the new ROMs. So it's quite convenient like that, but not if you want to keep it quit. Okay, so that's not running, and we just created a controller file, which we'll come and see in a minute. And that's all you need from there, really. So if we go back to the home directory, you can see that we had those two main directories, and the main use of the RetroPie directory there is to put your ROMs in, which are in here. Ooh, spell right. So those folders there, and you can do that with FTP client or USB stick. There's plenty of videos to show that. Okay, I want to put a space there. And there's nothing else really you need in this directory except if you've got a BIOS for a system that it insists on, you can put it in the BIOS directory there. Like Amiga, for example, you'd put the Kickstart ROMs in the BIOS directory. Okay. Now, RetroPie setup, where we just... we'll get that right. RetroPie setup. In there, the only thing that I would run is that RetroPie setup. Certainly to start with, until you're more familiar with everything, but that's where we go. And then if you do want to read a file, which would be in white, say for example this readme, you can just type nano, because there'll be plenty of files that are useful to read, not least the configuration files, and it'll just bring up that, and Control X to get out of that. Okay, so back to the home directory. Done both of those. One directory that's useful, besides this one, because this is in the home directory Pi. Now we're going to go and look at Emulation Station. Although, if we quickly look here, there was that folder we saw earlier which was .emulation station, and we can see the use for this in a minute, but I'll just quickly go in there now to have a look. So in Emulation Station, it's got ES input, which is the controller configuration for Emulation Station. It's not the controller configuration for the emulators, RetroArch, or anything else. It's just Emulation Station, and we can read that again with the nano command. Nano ES input, and you can see it's just got the configuration here for my Buffalo stick. That isn't what we just set up. That was done separately when I booted into Emulation Station and asked you to input that. So if you have a problem with the Emulation Station control, you can go in this directory, delete that file, and it will ask you to recreate it when you start it again. So it's just a way of getting it to back out of there. Then if you have any problems with Emulation Station, maybe it's crashing or something else, you can check out the log file. I don't know what's in my log file though, just have a look. Okay, it's just saying what it did at, okay, it doesn't have timestamps, so it's not necessarily massively useful, although if I quit out of here and we run the other command, LAH, to give me a bit more detail, I can see the last time it was written to was today about 3:15, so I could always sort of sync it up with what I did there. But anyway, it's a good debugging, useful debugging tool you can use. ES settings, I think that just sets the settings, like do you want to click when you scroll menus, or do you want to fade when you change from system to system. But we can have a quick look in there with Nano ES settings. Yeah, it's just false and true values and some times, etc. It's pretty self-explanatory about what each one does. And then game lists. Game lists are the files that show you your games in a bit more detail, so they hold the description or they hold reference to where the image is for that, so you get a little screenshot and details like how many players a game is, that sort of thing. So if we go into game lists, it should be listed by system, so you get a folder for all the systems. And if we go, let's look at SNES one, there's gamelist.xml, and that's what Emulation Station reads. If we read that, again, don't edit these if your Emulation Station's open, because it really doesn't like it. Okay, Nano game list. Ah, that one's empty. Oh, I know why that is. Okay, that one's empty because if I go back to my home directory and into RetroPie, ROMs, SNES, and if you're not sure about a directory name, and I'm typing it here, SN, and I can't remember the rest for whatever reason, you just press tab there and it'll auto-complete directories for you as well. Okay, so in there, I've got various files including a game list XML, which I generated, because by default Emulation Station will first look in the same directory as the games, so it'll read that one first. And if we read it, we see we've got loads of details. We've got the name of the game, we've got the full description, we've got where the image is located for it, and also how many players it is. We've got 2 there, genre, and everything else. So that's where Emulation Station reads those files. Okay, let's go back to the home directory, and I don't think there is anything else in here that's necessarily worth checking out at the minute. Okay, so Emulation Station, I suppose another configuration file for it is in etc Emulation Station here. So this is the directory we're in now. Now if I list that directory, it's where the themes are stored, and it's also where the main ES systems CFG is referenced, and that's a really important file. You shouldn't ever really need to touch it, to be honest, but it's worth knowing that it's there, and I'll show you what's in it now. So if we edit this, and if I wanted to make changes to it, I'll often edit it as with higher permission, so sudo nano es, just in case by default it didn't let me edit it. So if I open that, you can see here you've got a list of all the systems, and if we're looking for a particular one, I'm going to search with Control W and I'll look for SNES. Say. Okay, so it's taken me here, and I can see this in this file that Emulation Station uses to present its menu system and what systems are available. It will show the SNES if there are ROMs in the directory, which there are, we saw that earlier, and it's called it Super Nintendo. This is the path that it's going to look for those ROMs, which is where we were earlier in that directory. That tilde just means the home directory, so it's a shortcut to say home pie. And here are the extensions that it'll run. If the ROM has got a different extension to that, it's unlikely to work or show up. Then this command is really important, and it's changed effectively quite a lot from previous versions of RetroPie. This is version 3 beta 2. The previous versions had a longer command here that detailed a lot more, but now this command is pretty brief. It runs this script here called run command, which we can look at in a minute, and it passes it some parameters, 0, and in this case 0 and sys, and they'll pretty much all be 0 and sys. And these parameters manage things like what resolution you should open the game in, and what emulator you should run to run the game. So it's quite configurable. You can set when you run a particular ROM or you run a particular system like Super Nintendo, you can the GUI when you run the game will give you options to say which emulator do you want to use for this. And to get into that option screen, when you run a game in Emulation Station, you'll see at the top of the screen flash up, press X or M, I think it is, to get into a menu. So you just tap X, and it's only there for about a couple of seconds before the game boots, but if you tap X you then get into the menu to say which emulator you want to run if you don't want to run the defaults, and it's got a few options to tweak there, and those options that you choose there are saved within this run command process. So really you never really want to change this command line to add configuration files in or anything like that, or certainly not from version 3 anyway. Yeah, we'll look at that in a minute, but that will basically pass, when I say pass I mean P-A-R-S-E, or process files. And that's the structure of it really. So you can always put new entries in if you're comfortable to do that, or just leave them as they are, and they won't appear until they've got ROMs in these directories anyway. So that's where that file is. Then there's a backup of that and the themes directory. Now themes are a bit more involved. I won't really go into that, just to say that's where they are. There's one installed by default. Okay. Now the main, well not the main, but a key directory in this is opt. So if I change to opt here and list that, we've got I think VC is something to do with sound or something. I've never really gone in there, so ignore VC. RetroPie is the one that we need, so change it to RetroPie. So I'm now, well, as it says there, I'm now in opt RetroPie, and in here I'm going to put LAH just to get a clearer view. I've got 5 folders. Supplementary, well, let's go into each one. I'll start with supplementary. I'll go in there first. Okay, so in here, the folders, the only 2 folders we're interested in really, Emulation Station, which is where that is, and if we go into Emulation Station, there are some really useful readmes on how themes are used and the game list that we saw earlier. So if I edit read the game list file, you can see up here that it's got loads of useful detail on how the game lists are used, but also where it find them. So by default it will look in the folder that it's running from, so where the ROMs are, and if a game list.xml isn't in there, then it will look in that hidden folder in the home directory under the system name, which is where we saw the empty SNES file a minute ago. And if it's not in there, then it will look in etc Emulation Station game lists and look in there as well. So it's just useful to know where it's looking to try and find these game list files, because sometimes it's finding it, yet you might look at this one and it would be empty in your directory, but that's just because it's found it at this path instead. So 3 different places by default it's looking, and you can check out the readme anyway. Control X, okay, that's where Emulation Station is. And the other command, run command, which is what we saw earlier in the Emulation Station configuration file. There's the script, run command.sh. Now if I open that, now you should never edit this unless you're very confident in what you're doing. There's no reason to edit it at all. I would definitely leave it alone. Reading that, it says at the bottom 684 lines of script. Oh, it also says no write permissions. I didn't open it with the sudo command, so I can't accidentally make a change I didn't mean to. And really it's just the configuration file to manage video modes, which emulator you're going to run, and those sort of things. And you can see here on the screen it's got some default directories set for the purpose of the configurations, which is a major piece we'll see in a minute. It's got video modes, what video modes it should run in, which emulators. It just shows you here what it's going to do for that. And you can read down, it's commented quite heavily, so you can see what it's doing if you want to scroll through and check that out, but you don't need to, and I wouldn't recommend that you do anything with that really. It's just where it is. Okay, so going back a directory up here, now let's have a very quick look at ports. that shows an emulation station under the ports, and that's where Duke Nukem and Quake are stored. Don't need to do anything with that. And then we've got two folders, emulators and libretro cores. Emulators are the emulators that run the various games, and the libretro cores are the other, well, they're the cores of the emulators that go through libretro. So both of these folders effectively run ROMs. It's just slightly different in their setup. So all of the ones in libretro cores will use the retroarch.cfg files for configuration. So if we have a look in there, we've got all the LR, obviously libretro. We've got FCEUM, I think that runs the NES emulation. What else have we got? Estopia, that's another NES emulator. Pico Drive is a Mega Drive and Master System emulator. SNES obviously another SNES one. PC Engine, I guess that is. N64 one there. So any games that are emulated using these cores or these emulators will use the RetroArch same configuration. So once you've got one RetroArch configuration set up, it's easy to get them all going. LRFB art there. If I go into one of these directories, you can see there won't be an awful lot to it. Probably just the SA. Yeah, this SA file is the core, and then we've got a few readmes about these as well. So it's useful if you want to read about the core or the version of it, that sort of thing. But again, you should never need to go in there, change anything or anything like that. So come out of libretro cores, and the other one is emulators, which are the emulators that aren't based on libretro. So we've got PyFBA, that's obviously a standalone FBA emulator. DGen, which is a Mega Drive one. Again, obviously that doesn't use libretro/RetroArch configuration files. Advanced MAME you got, and RetroArch emulator, which will pass the libretro cores through most of them. ScumVM for those RPG type games. UA4, the Amiga emulator. So yeah, these are all the ones that don't use the configuration of RetroArch in here, except RetroArch obviously. Right. Okay. Let's have a look. Configs. Now this is probably, let's go in configs. This is where it starts getting useful. The rest is just sort of FYI really. In configs, we've got a configuration folder for all of the emulators. Plus, we've got a configuration folder for all of them. Now, let's think in the best way of checking this out. Okay, so if we go in the all folder and list what's in there, you can see we've got the RetroArch CFG, and all of the libretro cores will pass that RetroArch CFG to it. So the settings in there will run on all of the games, regardless of the controller you're using, regardless of the system you're using. It applies to all of them. And we can see that better actually if we go back a directory and we'll choose SNES as an example. Now when you choose a game to play in Emulation Station, that run command will kick in, and it will, the first thing it will do in terms of the configuration files to read, the first one it will read is this one here in the system specific directory. In this case, apt RetroPie configs SNES, and that's the first thing it will open. So well, it's the first thing it will open if you're using RetroArch. And you can see in here you've got Emulators CFG as well. I'll open that one up, and you can see that in Emulators CFG, and that will be in, there'll be an Emulators CFG in all of the systems. You can see for the SNES, there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different emulators configured, 4 of which are RetroArch based. So you've got quite a lot of choice, there, and the emulators file is quite useful in that it's going to show me how the configurations run. So let's say, well, you can see the default if you don't change anything. By default, the Super Nintendo one is going to run libretro SNES 9x-next, which is this one here, this row here. So Emulation Station, you run your SNES, assuming you don't press X to change the emulator you're using, it will run default and it will run this command. So the first thing it will do is run retroarch, then it will pass a libretro call to retroarch of SNEX. This is the directory we were in a minute ago, the libretro calls. It's passing that core.so, and then it passes a configuration file, which is opt retropie configs SNES, which is in the same directory, retroarch. It'll do that, and then the last thing, it will just run the ROM. But that is the retroarch file that it runs, and there aren't any appended configurations here. It's not telling it to run anything else in addition to that. It's just running that configuration, and whatever that says, it will run with. So if I quit out that with Control X, we can see that if we run an emulator, the SNES, by default, it's going to go in here, it checks the emulators, see which one it should be running, and then it's going to pass the retroarch.cfg. I realise this is a bit convoluted, and I'm probably not making it the clearest that I could, but hopefully you can follow this, and I'll put some text in a forum post just to sort of try and clarify the route that this is all going. But in essence, if you're running libretro cores, let's SNES for an example, it will run retroarch.cfg first, so ignore the other configuration files. That's the one it's going to process because emulators.cfg told it to. So let's read it. No, retroarch.cfg. Okay, now commonly in configuration files you'll often see a hash symbol like that, a space and then a load of text. The hash means it will ignore that line. Whatever's reading it will not process or read this line at all. So that's why it's just pure text. It knows that it's not going to read it. But although it's extremely similar, that line above does not mean ignore that line. When it's like that, hash, no space, and then include right next to it, that means it's going to process another file. And you can see here that it's going to process this or retroarch. So don't take that hash out because it won't work properly. That hash needs to be there to include this file. And this is why if you start renaming files to be retroarch or pasting a load of text in one file and taking out another, it can get a bit confusing about where everything goes. It's best to keep it with this type of setup, as in the default runs this retroarch file, and then the first thing it does is goes and processes everything in the main retroarch file, and it's the main one because it's in the all directory, and anything you put in there will get run by any game regardless of controller or system. Okay, then further down you've got once it's finished processing that, it will continue to process this file and run through these lines. So it will set the video shader enable equals true, video smooth equals false, etc. Now one thing I've found, which just adds to the confusion, is if in this file, this main file, the all retroarch CFG, and I'll open it in a minute, you can see that. Let's say for example it's got in this file, it's got this line, video underscore shader underscore enable equals true. So that value's already been set. If that value's already been set to say, I don't know, say it's been set to true, when you come into this file, if we said that should be set to false instead, it won't update it. It will stick with the first time it was told to do something. So it stays false. I've checked this with a save game variable, and it definitely was the case with that, and it was confirmed by the RetroArch devs. That's how it's working at the moment. So if you want to set something system specific and it's already been set in the RetroArch override, and to be honest, you're not going to have that many overrides in the main RetroArch file because it wouldn't be applicable to a lot of systems. You wouldn't set a save directory in the main RetroArch file because then all systems would be saving in that same directory. So it's unlikely you'd set many system-wide settings in here. The ones that you would set are more generic and are applicable to all the systems. So yeah, if you did want to set something to override whatever RetroArch CFG setting, put it in above the line, put it in over here, because then if you put your new setting at the top, that's going to be set first before it's had chance to process that file, and it will remember your setting that you put up here. So it's a little confusing, but that's how it works at the moment. What's an example of that? I know that I was setting specific directories for where the SNES emulator should save its games, and I was putting it down here. And because I put a generic set, because I was testing it in the main RetroArch file, when it came down to the SNES was still using the main RetroArch location for it, and I was a bit confused why it wouldn't be paying attention to the settings here, and it's just because it was already set there. Now, if in the main RetroArch file you've got a value like video shader enable equals, but it's just blank up in the top file in the main RetroArch file, then that doesn't count as setting it as blank. You can still set it. So the true here, the value here, would still overwrite it because you haven't set it up there. It's just been mentioned. If mentioned's the right word. Yeah. So that's the file that it will process for all of the settings. And if you want something specific, like a shader, that's in here by default. It's a good example. If you enable the shader, in fact, I think the default here is false. I've put this one on. True. If you enable that, that will get set because it's not set. The value of the video shader isn't set in the retroarch.cfg file. I feel like I've sort of talked in circles a few times, but hopefully it's clear. Yeah, so that's where you put those settings. And this file is also where you might put any override settings for controllers for that system. So when we look at the controller setup for RetroArch setups, you'll see a load of keys set for it, but you can put down here any overrides for that if you want to swap the buttons around. That's where they are anyway. So it's saying, do I want to change it? No, I don't want to change it. There we go. Right, that's in that directory there. We go back here, configs for all of them. It's all going to be largely the same for these, so there's no point me going in all of them. I'll go into all directory because that is where the main RetroArch sits, and you can see in this main retroarch.cfg file it's got 745 lines. It's pretty big, but it's got a lot. In fact, the majority are commented out with a hash in space. Remember, that's different to that hash include where it includes a file, but these are all commented out. Now we were looking at the shader, so if I control W shader and search for the word shader, that was Control and W to bring that up. Shader, I'm going to hit Control W, enter again till I get the one I want. Oh, that's it there. The video shader enable. Now, because that was set in the system specific SNES one, it would apply just to SNES. Because it's not set in this main one. It's got the hash to not even read that. But if I took that hash out and then put video shader enables equals true in here, but then in the SNES one I said it should be false, it won't listen to that false command because I've already set it here. So the rule, certainly appears to be from my testing anyway, is where you set it first is what it sticks with the value. And you can get round that problem if you really want to set a default of, say, true here. You just go in that system specific file and put your line at the top before it gets to process this file, so it's set first in the system specific one. Okay, yeah, then everything else is in this main folder. It's got, you know, vast majority of the RetroArch settings ready to use, and like I say, most of them are commented out, so they won't be read, but you can always take that comment out and use them. By default, it's got these are uncommented, so it would process these. By default, it's got the keyboard input for RetroArch. You can see there that the buttons are mapped to XLAS. Where has it got? Yeah, Enter R Shift Start and Select. So you could use that with the keyboard if you wanted. But I really wouldn't recommend putting anything in this file for controllers, because then you're really saying I want this controller for all systems to be used in the same way, so it's better to put it in the controller specific files, which we'll look at in a second. Okay, quit out of that, and you can see in this folder as well we've got a file called video modes. I'll quickly open that to show you that this is where when you start a game and you press X and you force a particular video mode for that game or system, it will write the video mode in this video modes.cfg file, and that's where it keeps it. So I've got, for the port, there's a game called Dinosaur, which is a port. Well, it's a game that's running under the port section anyway. And I've said I want to force it to run in this video mode, and the little graphical interface or text-based interface will set those values for you, so you can always open that and see what's been set. We can delete them if you don't want those, but again, that delete option's in the text interface, so you don't have to edit these files at all. Yeah, so I think in that directory that's all we need. I'll just quickly go back into the configs directory, and in here I'm going to go in the NES directory. So there you can see the emulators again, and you can see the RetroArch, and it's got one extra file here, which I'll cover in a second. We'll just quickly look at that emulators file, and you can see the NES has got two pre-installed emulators. You can always add more here, but that's probably another topic. Default is LibRetro Nesotopia, which is this one. So by default, the NES is going to open RetroArch, run the libretro core for Nesotopia, which is this one here, Nesotopia _ libretro.so, and then it's going to pass the file retroarch.cfg, which is that retroarch.cfg. And that's the same principle as we just saw in the NES. But the difference here is this file here, and I'm going to explain how this file's got generated. When you're playing a game through libretro, there's a RetroArch, and you use RetroArch as the front end. RetroArch has an in-game menu called RGUI, and you can set various settings in that RGUI. You can bring it up pressing F1, and then F1 doesn't work. Just hold down your hotkey enable button, which is usually select, and then press F1 and it'll fire up. Or hold down select and tap X. That combination should do it as well on the controller. And that will bring up a graphical menu that lets you tweak all the settings that otherwise you'd have to do in a text-based format. Now, when you make those settings, when you change those settings and save those settings, the emulator writes, or libretro writes, those configuration files back to its directory, which in this case here, I was using FCEUMM. I guess actually it's just open that emulators folder. Yeah, I was using that at the time, and it's written this configuration file. Now, because it's written that configuration file, you've seen from the previous 30 minutes of me waffling that it's not at any point going to see that file to process it when you run the game in the future. It's going to go to emulators. Emulators is going to tell it to process retroarch.cfg. Retroarch.cfg has the reference to the main RetroArch to also pull in, and then it finishes processing that. And it's never going to see that. So the changes you make and save are going to get put in here. Now, you could rename this file if you want to be retroarch.cfg, but then you'll lose any other changes you've made there. You'll lose the reference to pulling in the main RetroArch file. It could be a bit messy. So it's easier to open up if you want to get the settings that you've selected in there through the GUI. So in the GUI you might, there's loads of settings that you might want to change, and you're not sure where it is to do on a text basis, so it's easier to do it in the menu. So you change it in the menu, you save it here, and you can open that up, and it's just a whole bunch of all of the commands that we saw in the much prettier RetroArch file earlier with the comments. This has just chucked out all of the values. But when you make a change, typically you'll know what you did in, like, maybe you selected a shader, or maybe you changed a video resolution, or maybe you changed a path or something. You'll know roughly what you're looking for. So for example, in here, let's say, what's a good example? Maybe I changed what shader to use. So if I hit Control W and then type shader, I can see here that in this custom file that I saved, video shader equals APT blah 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 blah, it's got a path there. What I could do, I could just go, right, yeah, I know that's what I've changed, and I've changed the enable to be false, although that would be true normally, but let's say those two lines are what I want. I highlight them, which has automatically copied them, and quit out of that, I can go into my system RetroArch file. What's going on here? I want to edit the RetroArch file, and I want to say in here, because I know this is the one that Emulation Station by default is going to end up reading, I'll paste those two lines in, and I've got those changes that I've made. Now obviously it's not, if I quit out of that a minute, it's not precise art with doing that. You can't necessarily say when I edit this file here, I know exactly which two lines, but quite often you can usually work it. It's not that difficult to try and find the ones that have changed. There's a few different ways of working out which lines you've edited as well. So it is possible to fish out of here what you're looking for. There you can see, for example, there's all the player controls. So if you tweak a control, you probably be looking under the input section here. So yeah, it shouldn't take too long to work out what the custom buttons are. Then put them in the RetroArch file. Just keeps it all tidier. But I'm sure I'll get plenty of questions about that. Feel free to ask in the comments or on the forum, and should be able to help you out. The last configuration, well, the last main configuration file that's worth looking at is if we go back a directory, out of configs, we go into emulators, and in emulators we look at RetroArch because so many games and options we run under RetroArch. It's a lot there. You can see here we've got, well, the whole shader and overlays is a whole separate video. I'll leave those alone. But configs is the key directory we want. Now you can remember, right near the start of the video, we configured a iBuffalo USB joypad, and this is the directory that it would have put that in because we configured it as a RetroArch controller. So I'll change into this directory, and let's have a look. If I list that directory in detailed view, there you can see these are all the pre-configured configuration files. Now sometimes it's possibly not advisable, but I quite like to clear all these out. I remove the lot, just delete them all, and then I can just see the ones that I'm using, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Anyway, there's two ways that you can see which is the most recent file that we edited or used. Now at the start, like I say, when we registered a controller, you don't have to do that because chances are your controller's already here. But it's a bit bounce and braces if you do, you know that it will be here. And you can see at a glance which one that you've configured, because by default, RetroPie 3 Beta 2 came out on April the 4th, and you can see the timestamp, it's the same on them all. Except we get today, May 24th, you can see a new one's been created, and that's the one that I want to use. And I can see that the one above, it probably existed anyway within the image, and if I was trying to be clean about this, I'd probably delete that file. So I'll just see if I can delete that file, the original existing one, just to make sure I know I'm definitely reading this one now when the game's open. And when you start a game, you'll notice in yellow text at the bottom of the screen that it's detected a controller, and it will spit out this name, I think, well, whichever controller you've got, it will say in yellow text at the bottom. So if you think you've got a particular one, yet the text says something else, you know there's a bit of a mismatch there. I'll just try removing that. It might not work because of permissions. Yeah, didn't like it. I'll just try sudo rm usb comma 2, hit enter. Yeah, okay, so if I did it sudo, and now if I do ls space -lah, we can see that I deleted the one I just created, which I didn't want to do. Okay, so you just make sure you type the right word. But as luck would have it, I know the contents of this file is the same as what I've just deleted anyway. So imagine that you've got the file that you created earlier rather than deleting it. And you can edit it, you can just check it out. And this is, like I say, applied for libretro cores only. It's not going to do it for those emulators we saw in the emulators directory, if that makes sense. Okay, so I want to have a look at my controller, which I know is this one here, USB _ 2. There we go. And then hit tab to auto-complete the rest. And in here, this is what it's created. It just says the name of the input device, Okay, why is my cursor moving? Decided to freeze. There we go, it's better now. That's the name of the device, and there's a couple of commands you can see outside of the text editor to show what USB devices you've got in. And if we did that, you can see in the device there's a store, the name is stored, and that's what it is. So LibRetro can match that up. And here are the buttons. So in effect, B, and in my controller, the B button is the sending signal of number 1, and Y is 3, and so on and so on, until we get to this. This is the last one here, the left, right, the shoulder buttons, and then we've got the main section here. Now all of these sections below this line here relate to hotkeys, and in RetroArch you can enable a shortcut effectively using the buttons. There's a separate video on hotkeys, so I won't go over that in detail, but you can see by default setting it up in the RetroArch wizard that we saw, or setup guide we saw earlier, will set these automatically for you. So by default it will set an enable hotkey button, i.e. press this to get hotkeys working, to be 6, and that's always mapped to select. So whatever your select button is, there you go, see 6, it's set it there. So if I hold down 6 or select and then press 7 in this case, which is start, that will exit the emulator, get back to Emulation Station. Also by default it's put a menu toggle button with 2, which I think is X, yeah, X. That will bring the RGUI setup up. It's got load state and save state shortcuts, reset to restart the game, like rebooting the game, and save state slot increase, so you can have multiple save states or save slots, so you can scroll through which of the 5, 10, 15, however many save states you've got, to put that in a different slot. But you can change these as well. Again, that's all covered in the hotkey setup, so I'm not going to bother with that. But the point is, that this file will be included when you run the RetroArch games, and if you wanted to overwrite some, say for example you didn't want the right and left to be 4 and 5, you could take it out of well, you could change it literally here if you want to change it for all the systems, but let's say you want to change 4 and 5 just for SNES. You copy it out there just by selecting it, quit out of that, go back a few directories until we go to the configs directory, go in SNES, list that, and edit the retroarch.cfg file, go to the bottom, right mouse, and that should overwrite those ones we saw earlier. And the way that it reads those ones earlier, like we saw in the Emulators file, it will open this file first, process, first thing it will do is process configs all retroarch.cfg, and if we go in configs all retroarch.cfg, it's a bit laborious I know, but you only have to remember it once. Configs change all, and change retroarch.cfg, read retroarch.cfg. In here you can see a bit for the auto configuration controllers. I'm trying to remember what that's called, so I'm scrolling. Auto config, I think it's auto config. Probably should have checked this before. Hang on, there it is. Right, okay, so here you can see it's uncommented, so it is doing this. The auto configuration directory is apt retropie emulators retroarch configs, which is where we were looking before, and you can see up here input auto detect enable true, so it's reading those files. You could change that to false if you never want those files to be read, and you could just hard code your controller values in the system specific RetroArch CFGs, but I think it's best set up as it is. You can always override them, and unlike with those settings I saw earlier like shaders, because those settings aren't set in this RetroArch file, i.e. the controller settings aren't set in the RetroArch file, you can override it by putting it underneath the include at the top. To be honest, if you're following this video and you understand what I'm talking about, well done you, because this is as I'm speaking, it's not very clear, but I'm hoping by the video you can kind of see at the same time what's needed to be done. Hopefully the associated forum thread would do with this, clarifies any queries people have got. But in essence, yeah, if we go back to that SNES directory one, SNES and edit retroarch.cfg, this is where I would put in, tap the right mouse button to paste in. I can override, I could put, oh actually I want the right button when I use a SNES to be button 3, whatever that was, like Y or something. Yeah, and you can override the particular ones there. But what I would avoid doing, as I've said before, in this type of directory, don't rename particular files retro.cfg or create new ones or change the structure that works. Keep the fact that the way it works is Emulators tells RetroArch what to do, it runs the command, and it says run that one first. In here it says the first thing I want you to do is include the main RetroArch file, and within that main RetroArch file it pulls in your controller file, which is set separately. I think that's largely what I wanted to cover. If there are any other questions or clarifications needed, let me know. This has probably been the least exciting video that's ever been done on RetroPie. Sorry about that, but hopefully it helps some people. Thanks.